you can use children's books as a conversation starter, as a way to actually build their picture of what the world is like. If you show them all books of a certain kind, that's the way they think the world is. So not just variety, but also really careful choices about worldview.
Well, welcome to another edition of AP's Profiles in Christian Living. My name is Mark Powell, and my special guest with me today is Dr. Jill Ireland. Jill is married with 6 children and also is an educator with a PhD in education. Jill, great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
Now, I'm going to start with a very Presbyterian question. It is AP's Profiles in Christian Living. Give us a quick recap of your life, particularly what brought you to faith in Jesus?
I've always trusted Jesus. So I was brought up by wonderful, wonderful Christian parents who were Presbyterians from the day they were born till the day they died. And we had lots of real, authentic Bible conversations. We learnt to sing. We learnt to be involved in the church. And I don't remember a time when I didn't trust God.
Wow.
My parents were wonderful mentors. Lots of my friends adopted my parents as their Christian parents. And so a lot of opportunity. Obviously, as you grow older, you confirm your faith at various times, but it's always been very much part of who I am, and I've always felt the call to serve God.
Yeah, fascinating, because you've actually led a very full and rich life. You've studied here in Tasmania. You've also studied in Oxford. Tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, when I was 14, I decided I wanted to go to Oxford or Cambridge. I didn't know anybody who'd ever been, but I knew that every time I opened a Penguin novel, it said educated in Oxford and Cambridge. So being a literary type, I was very keen. So in third year at uni, I started applying for Oxford. Oxford's the sum total of 35 colleges. You apply to each college. And so I applied, and in between applying, which took 18 months, and getting an offer, I got married. So I got a scholarship. One, we're on a honeymoon, and we decided to go to Oxford and make it happen. So my husband was managing the Beaconsfield gold mine here in Tasmania, and I was a new grad. And so off we went at 20 and 31 to Oxford, and had a fabulous time. I think it was important to me to be studying Christian poets, so I did John Donne and T.S. Eliot. That's 16th and 20th century. And Eliot said he was very influenced by Donne. What I really found out was that actually he wasn't very influenced in his literary work, but he was influenced as a Christian. So both of them began they were brought up in minority Christian traditions, a Unitarian for Eliot, and of course Catholic in a very tough time for Catholics, for Donne, and they both became spokesmen for the Anglican Church. So I was given a chance by my professor to have an additional supervisor who was a keen Christian to look at what were these poets' Christian lives about, and why did Eliot want to be seen as like Donne? What was it that was going on? So meanwhile, my husband had a lovely 3 months working for a mining company, got sacked for being honest, and then had a great time doing renovations for the church, built a coffee shop in the crypt under the church at St Aldate's. We were in a church where people like Os Guinness and Michael Green, great writers in Christian circles, were hanging out with us and writing stuff and talking about their research with us.
Wow.
So I was keen to do a short piece of research because Steve was leaving his career. And so I did a Master of Letters in half the normal time, which is the normal research master's degree in literature. It was very valuable for me to build the skills and to feel capable, but also to feel that I was polishing my writing skills and learning to communicate to all kinds of people. So our church had a wonderful Sunday night called where they had people shared their research with people in the church. So instead of thinking your academic work is over there at uni and your church stuff's on Sunday, they really did a great job of getting us together and saying, your research is underway. Why are you doing it? Why are you bothering? What are you finding out? And they had speakers like Bishop Stephen Neal, Bishop of South India. Os Guinness himself was talking about his book, brand new book, just hot. It was his PhD really, The Gravedigger File, which is a bit like Screwtape Letters. And so all of that was going on as this wonderful banquet of stuff to enjoy. Steve even came along, despite being a mining engineer, to postgrad English seminars, and nobody ever sprung him for not having a degree in English. But it was a very a great time for building relationships with Christian people in all kinds of disciplines, not just English and not just literary. We've kept in touch with some of those folk and been to see them, but it was a bit of a privilege to be there. And the striking thing for some people when we left was when they said, what are you going to do? I said, we're going to go and live in the outback, and Steve's going to mine in this little ghost town with one hotel that used to have 22, that's nearly nothing left. And I'm going to have children. Now, that's a pretty brave thing to announce, and I guess I was 23 and brave. Didn't happen for several years, and that made me feel I had to remind myself my identity was in Christ, and I really wanted to have a pile of children, but that was up to him. And I'd obviously kind of closed the door on the academic thing by marrying a mining engineer and coming back to the outback. If you are involved in mine management, you live in all sorts of obscure places, and I'd committed myself to coming to. And I knew that God would, he would give me opportunities to serve and use my gifts. I just didn't know what they were. So they were a bit surprising, helping in the local primary school for a few years. And then finally managing to have the first child. I think my parents having their last child when we older kids were 18, 16 and 15 really opened my eyes to that whole miracle of a little person that's from the two of you, but who is full of potential, and that you get the chance to shape who they are. So I was very dedicated to being a Christian wife and mother, and very conscious that God would provide what we needed, even if we were 650 k's from the nearest big town. We sort of went from the frying pan into the fire. We went from 1,200 people at every service at St Aldate's in Oxford to 6 in the little church in that small country town of 300.
Wow.
The ministers were alternate weeks, Anglican and Uniting. One flew in a little plane that he flew himself, a former squadron leader during the war, and brought the keyboard under his arm for his wife to play. There were 6 of us, including the minister and his wife. And then from there, we finally were having this baby, moved to Perth for a city job, and we lasted about 3 weeks, had the baby, got offered a really interesting job. Same kind of mining process for Steve, so interesting for him, in the middle of North Queensland. So the nearest town was Mount Isa, 140 k's to town. You did not see a single building in between. Church was a great little Presbyterian church up above it's now turned into a kindergarten, I think. And it was a nice bunch of people, almost no grandparents in a place like Mount Isa, so your young families. Our minister was a Presbyterian missioner. And we drove 140 k's into church, and we drove 140 k's home again. And sometimes he said, I feel I should have a good sermon because Jill and Steve have come a long way. We only missed one Sunday, and that's because there was a flood, and we had 8 curves of the river between us and the town. And so if you got stuck between those 8 with your week-old baby or 3-week-old baby, that was a bit tricky. So we did miss on that one occasion. But again, some people make it sound as if you only get intellectual and spiritual stimulation if you're living in some great big exciting place like Oxford or London or Sydney. We found it in this little mining camp out of Mount Isa. We find it in a little country town where we live now. And I think there's a sense in which, for me, when I chose to marry a mining engineer, I chose to give up some of the academic expectation, chose to take on the adventure and see where it took us, chose to put wife and mother first, and then God has provided all those things I let go of. He's provided in remarkable ways since then. So no complaints from me.
Yeah, I want to get to that in just a moment, because you did a lot of research specifically on children's literature. But tell me, what was your own philosophy and practice as a mother raising your children,
Right. Yeah.
particularly in relation to literature?
Yeah, well, we've always been very keen readers with children, and we provided lots of opportunity. So we have a house full of books, most of them secondhand. We meet authors and get all of their books. We often talk to children about the authors as well. So my little tiny grandchildren will say, oh, this is an Alison Lester, because we've been talking about who she is and how she writes. Lots of opportunity for reading. We were, let's face it, so far from anywhere in some of these places that you needed to provide all the entertainment yourselves. We don't have telly. We haven't had telly since we've been married, 42 years. We do other things instead. I think not having telly provides you with good time for reading books. I felt very called to motherhood, and I've really enjoyed the chance to serve in that area. And I think you get to know what your kids want to find out about, what they're scared of, what their aspirations are, and you can use children's books as a conversation starter, as a way to actually build their picture of what the world is like. If you show them all books of a certain kind, that's the way they think the world is. So not just variety, but also really careful choices about worldview. I often think about, is this book about hope or despair? What are the chances for these characters to have hope for the future? That's all important to me. And I've often had to talk to parents about that kind of thing. If they've got a depressive kid who's reading Harry Potter 6 and they've just read all of them in a row, is that helpful for this depressive kid to sit in a black room and read that book all the time? They might need to have something which is a bit more full of opportunity.
So what you're saying is it's really important as parents to oversee our children's intellectual diet.
Yep, very much so. And I think it's important for them to read models of different people that are like them and unlike them, but also to talk with your kids about how are these characters treating each other? What's going on with the mother here? Often these days, books for children have a really dud father. They have adult figures who are male, who are negative, who are absent, who are foolish. What does that tell your kids? That's not the way I want to build my kids' and my grandkids' picture of fatherhood. So there are lots of questions to ask about books, about what kind of world is this author coming from. I read interviews with authors and I read what authors write about themselves. I say to schools, is this the kind of author, is this author the kind of person you'd like to befriend your child? If not, why are you having them as a mentor in your school? So thinking about, what life story those people have and where they're heading with children.
So you mentioned something earlier about talking to your children, not just about the book, but about the author. Can you explain why that's so important to know about the author?
Yeah, well, I think particular authors convey a view of life. Did you know that after John Marsden wrote many of his difficult, challenging, depressing, stressful books, he said, I don't have any children, but if I did, I wouldn't let them read my books.
Oh, wow.
He was protecting his own nieces and nephews from his books. That tells you something about probably his later in life recognition as now a person who owns a school, to think about how children's view of the world is shaped by what they read. And I think of authors as children's friends, and we did a bit of shaping of who were our children's friends. There are things that can really harm a child, and there's some protection early, and then there's some careful exposure, but you can't read everything, so you're still going to make discerning choices. I like to choose the ones that are going to be building kids up.
So can I just take up that example with John Marsden? One of his most popular series is Tomorrow When the War Began. Would you recommend that for children?
I don't. One of the things that I found in my research about adolescent fiction in Australia was that there was a turn in the late 80s and early 90s to books in which the only heroes are teenagers, in which all of the adults are psychotic, malicious, mentally ill, just generally useless, but often overtly negative. I actually think it's good for children and students to have some books where there are some positive interactions with adults, where not everything in the world relies on the kids solving everything. Lots of my friends enjoy the John Marsden series with their kids. I wouldn't be recommending them for a range of reasons, and I think some of his early work, he was milking the taboos all the way to the bank. So books about kids who have acid thrown in their face by their father, I don't give my 12-year-old that kind of book.
Maybe even a little bit more controversial. What's your thoughts on Harry Potter?
I was actually asked to speak on Harry Potter when number 4 first came out. I was with Sandy McCutcheon on ABC Australia Talks Back. I had to read the book really fast that day because I hadn't read it before. But my concerns about Harry Potter are not most people's concerns. I'm concerned about the way that adults you should be able to trust are represented, and about how the adults you should most be able to trust turn out not to be trustworthy. I'm concerned about the encouragement by the adults for kids to cheat. People often think that Christians are worried about witches and swearing. I actually think the view of people is just as important, or probably more important. And so with a book like Harry Potter, there's lots of fun in it. Lots of families, lots of Christian families really enjoy it. I've got some reservations about the view of the world. I wouldn't encourage a teacher to teach them. I would recognise that most families who want their kids to read Harry Potter have a copy already. So, but again, look below the surface. What else is going on here? What is there here about trustworthiness and about honesty and about what you value and what you disparage? All of those things. I mean, again, you could read those with your kid at a certain age and explore them. I actually got my oldest child to read number 6 when he was about 16. I said to him, do you recommend this for your younger siblings, of whom four live younger siblings? He said, no, Mum, I've read it and I don't think that's not ready for them yet. They'll read it sometime when they're ready. But the picture, the scary presentation of Harry Potter's parents dying, there are kids for whom that would be pretty seriously problematic. And I do know children who are depressed, who were reading so much Harry Potter. When their mother talked to me about it, I said, A, see this doctor, your kid's probably depressed. But I also said, have you thought about that darkened room and those 6 books he's been reading and rereading? Wouldn't you like him to be reading something that's a bit more open to possibilities and a bit less controlled by all of the circumstances in the Harry Potter world?
So I want to get to what literature you'd suggest in just a moment, but how would you respond to the argument, I'm just really glad my child's reading and they're off the screens. They're doing something constructive. Surely reading itself is good.
Reading itself is a great thing. The typical thing with children is that they want a diet of one thing. So do you let your kid eat hamburgers every night? I don't. Some kids will only choose popcorn and bubblegum in books. They'll just choose pretty princess pink Barbie stuff. And if you fed your kid that, you're basically encouraging them to think that that view of the world is an accurate picture. So variety is the major thing. Make sure there's a big variety, but there are lots of things I think are too frivolous or too depressing or too negative in their view of what's possible in the world for me to want to recommend them. I've got hundreds of books that I do enjoy and recommend. In fact, people in my town come to my house to borrow a box full for their kids in the holidays, and they bring back that box and get another one next time.
So parents that are listening or watching this and they're thinking right now, okay, so what are my options?
Okay.
Where do you go to find good suggestions?
The first thing to do is to go to 5 Senses Press and get a book called What Should My Child Read by Susan Moore. She was brought up as a Jewish person and became a Christian in later life, teacher educator. I helped with that book, I should say that. She has basically written for parents a book that helps for 8 to 11s and 11s to 15s when the books you want to buy for your kid are too long to read in the bookstore, which I do up till that stage. Her book gives you a paragraph or two on hundreds of books of all different ages. I don't mean ages of children, I mean vintages. And so it means you're not just getting the latest thing. She'll say this one's good for a town library, this one might only be in secondhand shops. But what she does is she signals which ones have hope and opportunity and something positive, which ones are dark but really thoughtful, well considered, which ones she might have queries about. And she often says, for which kind of child? So I've probably bought 50 copies and given them away. I did help her with some updates of the more relatively recent books at a certain stage. But lots of great ones to start with there. And again, it reminds us...
what's the name of the book again?
What Should My Child Read?
Okay.
Get it from the publisher, 5 Senses Press, which is an Australian publisher. Again, it just helps parents feel they're beginning to get educated. I also buy the Children's Book Council's magazine and another magazine called Magpies, which come out 6 times a year. They give me reviews of every new book. I often lend those magazines to people, but if you're a teacher educator, if you're a teacher or a librarian or a grandparent that buys books, it's really worth being well informed. There are great authors out there. You read the interview and you think, they've really got an interesting outlook on life. They've done some interesting things. They're positive. I might look up their books for a child. I also never recommend a book or give one away until I've read it. Don't give any books to teenagers until I've read them. I often pencil inside for my friends 15 plus.
And I could also say too, one of your jobs is as a judge or critic on top awards. How did that happen?
Okay, I had an interesting visitor once who I offered to accommodate at my house, and we at that stage had 5 children, concrete floor in the playroom. I put a mattress down for him and his wife, and we had a lovely time. He was visiting my next door great aunt who was a missionary. And at the end of the week, we had a little conversation, and this guy said to me, I have had a really terribly hard task. I've been sent 90 books in the mail. I have to read them all, rank them, and then go to a meeting to judge them. This was the Australian Christian Book of the Year Award. And he said, it's a bit like hell for me. And I said, oh, that sounds like heaven to me. He said, you're in. So he put my name down. And then I said to him, what sort of work do you do? He said, I'm at the cathedral. I work at the cathedral. I thought, okay. And we pressed him a bit further because who knows what he was doing at the cathedral. And he said, yeah, I'm the assistant bishop. And I thought, there I am. I've had the assistant bishop on the floor, on the concrete floor on a mattress. But that led to several times judging that award. And you get quite a good picture of what's being published in Australia. Even self-published works get there. It's often 90 or 100 books a year. They publish, this is the Spark Lit, which used to be the Australian Christian Literary Society. They publish a really good shortlist. You can read all the books on the shortlist and feel well informed about this year's Christian books. But they also sponsor a literary award for a young person writing. So I think it's under 25 or something like that. And they even have a teenage writing award. The author is a teenager, not the reader. Good on them, I say, for thinking of something that would encourage that young person who's got a bit of creative flair, that's a Christian, that's well read, that's thinking about how might I write a book that at least in some way has a thread of something about my Christian faith. And they're often a bit oblique, which is not a bad idea. But they're also, I think it's great for the church to encourage young people who are thinking of writing as a mission contribution.
So I'm going to put you on the spot here. Mm-hmm. Give me 5 books that really stand out for you that every parent should recommend to their children.
Okay. Anything by Madeleine L'Engle. Okay. So Wrinkle in Time was her most famous, but she's written probably 20.
Okay.
She manages to be a really literary author, a Christian who you can see a thread, and it's definitely the worldview, but it's not pushy.
Okay.
And kids love them. It doesn't matter how long it is since they've been written. There's some new ones I'd recommend by Kristen Scott, who is a psychologist working at Sydney Missionary Bible College and an author. She's written a series of 3 recently, which are not science fiction, kind of historical, imaginative fiction, not the kind of thing I normally read, but she's done a really good job of building character, having a plot that takes you somewhere. She's a psychologist. She's thinking about what helps kids cope with the tough things in life, and it's sufficiently distant. It's mostly sort of pseudo-medievalish.
Okay.
So it's sufficiently distant from a child's current situation for them to get that objective distance, to be able to deal with complex, difficult, perhaps even a bit stressful kind of story and think, yeah, I can think about those ideas. It's not me. It's not year 12. It's not all set in my town in Australia. I think that helps some kids. That's very recent. I think the third one's only just hot off the press.
Okay.
Andrew Lansdowne. Anything by Andrew Lansdowne. So Andrew Lansdowne is famous as a Christian poet in Australia, one of the best poets in Australia, actually. Writes quite a bit for Quadrant, published probably 20 books of poetry. He's also published a series of 3 books for pre-teens and young teens, really. First one's called With My Knife. Second one's called Dragon Fox. Third one might be The Red Fox. They're published in Australia and in the States. He does a very good job of getting you in the mind of the character, but he has, I think the mum's died, and the dad is able to bring the benefit of scripture to this kid in a really natural way. The kid has had a pretty tough time.
So it's modelling really good, positive values and virtues.
He's a very literary author. And the Baptist Union in Australia, in Perth, has helped to pay his salary as a writer.
Wow.
You think, again, that's imagination and thinking of creative people as contributors to mission and ministry. So anything he's written, well worth reading. I have lots of authors I really enjoy for little people. One of the reasons I do is that they picture family life as something positive and worthwhile and adventurous and funny. So Alison Lester is always a standout, and I've met her. I've had her come to my town to help with a workshop we used to give a book for every baby born in Bega, a little committee, and we had 10 years of giving a book for every baby. That's about 300 books a year. And she always conveys something positive about family and farm life. And there's always something there's real life there, and then there's what the kid's imagining it is. And so with little people, talking about, even today I had a discussion with a 6-year-old. She said a friend was telling lies. I said, hang on, let's just have a little look here about, is she pretending to be a teacher? Your little 6-year-old friend says she's a teacher. Perhaps she means she's been teaching her little brother so that you have that opportunity. It's a moral issue for that child. She thinks her friend is telling lies. And so I think about those Alison Lester books where cleverly she's got the imagined is black and white. And then the next page, what's really happening, you think, okay, that kid is imagining that they're pirates and they're treasure, and they're just kids playing with mum and dad on the beach.
What's your thoughts about Tim Winton? because he's probably
Yeah.
one of the most famous
Yeah.
Australian writers who also identifies as a Christian. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think his Blueback, which is a book for young children, is very inspiring and encouraging. He's not my favourite. I actually once didn't give him a literary award. But I admire him for being willing to put his whole life into writing and to get flack from all sorts of people. He also has stuck out his neck about being a Christian, which is very unusual in the writing world. A lot of my friends really enjoy him. He's not to my taste as much as many other people. Another person I would really encourage parents to get for their children is Dick King-Smith. Now, I have a Dick King-Smith story in my family. Dick King-Smith always has positive parents. Quite often the father is a minister. He doesn't get rubbished or ridiculed. He isn't overly preachy or doesn't use Christianese. But the kids appreciate the dad, and he might solve the mystery or come up with a good idea. It made me realise how unusual that is. So
it is very unusual.
Dick King-Smith wrote the book Babe, the Sheep Pig, which was made into the movie Babe.
Oh,
He's
right.
probably written 50 books for children. One of my children was so appreciative of his little series about Sophie. Sophie is 6, Sophie is 7. Sophie is a lady farmer of that age. And my youngest child wrote a letter to Dick King-Smith saying, I loved your Sophie story so much. She's full of get up and go and she can do stuff. And quite a long letter from a 7-year-old, I suppose. And a few days later, 2 weeks later probably, we heard that Dick King-Smith had died. And my little kid, who's now a PhD in immunology, said to me, Mum, I'm really sad Dick King-Smith has died because I'll never get a letter back from him. So about a year later, we had a letter from Dick King-Smith's literary executor who said, Dear little Miss Rachel Ireland, the last letter that Mr. King-Smith answered before he died was for you, and I thought you would like to receive it. So we've preserved this letter, and it says, Dear Rachel, you have so many good ideas about my character, Sophie. I think you could write these stories.
How
I think
precious.
you could do it. And I thought, what a nice thing for the executor to think, this kid bothered to write a letter. And again, I'm thinking, Dick King-Smith comes across as a writer who's a nice, fatherly Christian. Good on him for writing to this little kid. He probably would have been 80 at the time. So, we've taken that letter to a few book clubs where we've got all the kids to look at Dick King-Smith books. I've also always recommended Colin Tearley, who was also a Christian, and he's long since died now, but he wrote to a whole class of my Year 7s once and answered their questions about books. He not only wrote for children, but he also wrote a couple of books about the early German Christian settlers in South Australia and the struggles they had to deal with their religious difference sometimes between their own German groups and sometimes between their Lutherans and other Christians there. They're I think one of them's called, not The Seed and the Sower. Anyway, they're very thorough adult novels about what is it like when your church has a big split over something really important and your daughter's married somebody on the other side of that discussion. What a great thing to explore in a novel.
Now, you made a really interesting comment a little while ago about the Baptist Union actually providing financial support to one author. I'd imagine there's people listening to this interview right now thinking, well, I'm a writer. I'm really interested in this. I'm keen to do this. There might be some out there that thinking, actually, I'm not a writer, but I want to support writing. What are some creative, out-of-the-box ways you think people might be able to do that?
Yeah. Well, I would imagine that a bequest from a person who's a really literary person that they'd leave for a prize or a support for publication, there must be people out there who are publishers, who are Christians, who could also be just willing to push against the tide of the negative, the contemporary, the gritty realism, and say there are some Christian authors out here who are they're writing for everyone, but they're Christians. They're not just writing for insiders. I think there's room for some creative thinking about supporting or sponsoring people who are writing. Certainly the Sparklit people do that with young people. What about camps for writers? Young Christian writers having a camp. I know that Scripture Union runs some study camps.
How important is that, do you think, in terms of developing new talent?
Mentoring. Yeah, often I think it's good for a young writer to have an older writer as a mentor. I know Andrew Lansdowne, for example, taught writing in prisons in WA. And you think to yourself, what a great, literally captive audience. There is a chance for mentoring from older or more established authors to younger authors, and I often put people in touch with each other. People often ask me, can I get them published? No is the answer, but I can put them in touch with some people who are published and see about how they've gone about it. Some people are enjoying creative writing at university courses. Some people are finding it pretty dampening. But I think it's often best to have a mentor who is good in your field but further ahead than you, and to spend time with them. But again, some of those mentors could run a good camp.
What advice do you give to people that are starting out?
Practice, 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 practice. I think too, don't make assumptions that one kind of writing is the only kind. I thought I'd be a creative writer writing novels. Most of my writing has been about worldview in children's literature. It's been for teachers or for parents and grandparents. I've edited books. I've done lots of literary things, but I haven't done what I thought I'd do. I've submitted a few stories in my time, but I think you lean on an open door and push it. And God has provided me with a lot of open doors, which are kind of a practical, down-to-earth application of my academic background to help ordinary people find good books for ordinary kids.
So that's interesting, because there's a distinction there, isn't there, between being a writer and being a reader?
Yeah. Well, everybody can be a reader.
Mm.
And everybody can share the books they love. I also think it's great if Christian people are sharing around the books they like. We have a new Christian bookseller in our congregation, and we have hundreds of people who are keen readers, and we're forever lending books to each other. Nobody needs to feel they can't read because they can't afford books. But I like people recommending what they really trust. Like, I would never go to a movie unless somebody I trust absolutely has recommended it. I wouldn't go on spec. I love reading books that somebody else has said, this was great because. So I think that's a great way to encourage young readers. But also, it's a bit of sharing who you are. I've been in book clubs where some people are Christians and some people aren't, and the books are varied. You get a chance to tell how this connects with your real life.
So let me ask you a personal question. What's a book that, outside the Bible, because I know you're a Christian, but outside the Bible, what's a book that's deeply impacted and even changed you?
Yeah.
That has stayed with you long after you finished it?
I've had several in my youth. So there was one called A Parcel of Patterns by Jill Peyton Walsh, and it was about a time it's pitched at 14, 12-year-olds, a time in England where the plague hit, and about a child who was carrying the parcel of paper sewing patterns from one village to another and brought the plague to that village. And that sense for her that she had caused a terrible thing for her village, but it was dealt with in a way that's manageable for a 12 to 14. You learn lots of history by mistake. But I remember thinking this author has thought about the inside of a kid's head at that age when something really terrible happens, and they have some conversations with older people who've lost family members and so on, but who tell this kid, you are not responsible for those big acts of God, if you like. And I remember thinking that was a very important way of dealing with a massive hardship in a way that a teenager can deal with. Likewise, things like Ian Serralia's The Silver Sword, kids being abandoned or orphaned in the Second World War and crossing Europe together with one adult helper. That sense that you almost travel with them. You're almost in the team. You're almost experiencing that challenge, adventure, hardship, but it's manageable for a kid of the age for which the language is written. Similarly, I think I've recently done a talk for my kids at my Anglican school about Corrie ten Boom and The Hiding Place. It's an amazing thing for a person to write their own story, which includes a young person's life in a concentration camp where everybody but one in her family dies, and then see that she comes home and she runs a refuge for Dutch people who had collaborated with the Jews and were therefore, because they were dying of starvation otherwise, and were therefore rejects and outcasts. And she made those people and adults with disabilities her main calling in life. You can read The Hiding Place at 12 or 14, there's a special children's edition, and you can read something truly ghastly that humanity did, but you can see Corrie ten Boom trusted what her father said when he said, you know how when we go to the train station, who carries the suitcase? And she says, you carry it because you're the father. I'm little and you're the father and you're strong. He said, every time you face a challenge in life, remind yourself, the father is strong. He can carry that suitcase. And so a lot of other challenges she
beautiful.
faced, she dealt with that. I had a lot of questions from kids afterwards about that. And I deliberately made sure that the school's 25 copies of that book were available at the front desk in the library afterwards so that kids could say, well, I know we don't normally read about concentration camps, but this is an accessible book written by a Christian who then lived the whole of the rest of her life in line with that terrible experience.
Now, you're the chair of a Christian school at the moment.
Well, it was a Christian parent-controlled school to start with in 1994, built in an abattoir in Bega. And in 2007, the Anglican Diocese of Canberra and Goulburn came in partnership with the school. It's now Sapphire Coast Anglican College. Yeah, I've been back on the board a few years. We run that school and a school 2 hours away at Bateman's Bay. It's a great opportunity for kids with no church background at all to come to a school where we have really insightful people giving talks to the kids, exploring ideas. We have a Christian counsellor. It's another form of ministry that I enjoy. It also uses some of those academic things that I've done. And because we started the school from scratch ourselves, I think I learnt to be in governance in a school, you have to be willing not to live by anecdotes and stories and my kid's class, and think about the whole school community and what serves everyone, a bit as we should do in a church context as well. It's not about me and my family, it's about the whole school's needs. And I think it's actually quite unusual for people to be able to separate themselves a little bit. I now have lots of young relatives in the school, but when I'm in governance, I'm the board chair, when I'm in governance, I'm thinking about the next 10 years, I'm thinking about supporting principals, I'm thinking about how can we make the school fulfil its mission and ministry, but connect with teenagers who've never heard any of this before.
So can I ask you a question with your chair's hat on? What do you think is going to be the greatest challenge for Christian schools in the next 10 years?
Oh, that's a very easy question. No, that's not a very easy question. I think some of those challenges are already there. The challenge to just be what the world is, and the challenge, there are legal complications with a lot of the changes in recent times in schools. But I think the challenges in schools are like the challenges in the world. We need to be able to explain our faith in normal language, always have a reason, do our research, have our evidence, don't give away more information than you need to, don't chatter about why you appointed this or that person, have good reasons, and I think keeping confidentiality about big strategic board things is an important part of staying, of having integrity, because it's easy for people to think you're going to chitter-chatter about the latest, whatever's on the news, but we have to be a little bit, take a little bit of distance, but also there are people who should speak for a school and people who should not. And as a board chair, I should only speak for a school when the principal has asked me to or the principal's not available. So I don't make public pronouncements about current affairs, for example, but I do make sure that in the school there's lots of opportunity for students to learn about positive biblical frameworks for things.
Yeah, excellent. Now, I'm thinking, just to wrap up, as I look at you and I think about you, I'd probably describe you in this order. You're a Christian, you're a wife, you're a mother, you're an educator, and tied in with that, a lover of books and reading. If you could go back in time and talk to your younger self, what advice do you think you'd give?
I think one of the things about Christian life is that you learn that what you let go of and you think is going to be important, it's a bit that it's the lose your life to find it principle. If we hold on to what we are aiming for with tight little hands, that makes us anxious and concerned about the future. I think it's been wonderful for me to learn, let go and let God. Let God make the opportunities. If you see them, take them. So as a couple, we tend to say, this looks like a really good opportunity for me to use my skills and gifts. let's have a go and see how it works. And I think not worrying about, I don't have a career plan, I'm 61, I've been all sorts of things, including an academic, but I'm just willing to see what options God has for me. That's something I did learn early, but I think you learn it in practice later on by having God provides what you need, even when you didn't know you needed it. And you have a go and you think, oh, that was satisfying. It seemed to be helpful for these and those people. So I let the opportunities come. I don't go out searching for them. And I have some pretty much every week.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thanks so much. It's been really stimulating to talk to you. Every blessing with the school. This has been Mark Powell for AP's Profiles in Christian Living. I hope you've been as blessed by this interview as I have, and I look forward to seeing you next time.